Continuing with my list from last time that I was making about my observances of where secularism ultimately falls short. One point that was noticeable to me, people sought happiness and not much else. People routinely sought comfort in fantasies, like if only I could have this, then I'll be happy. It was quite often the idea of romantic love, usually, often a certain lifestyle, or getting to do what they want in the easiest, most comfortable, risk-free way. It's also a lot of hoping that other people could instill in them the happiness that they desired. But I think, as we know, people don't have the power to make you happy. And if you put everything of you into another person, they will always inevitably disappoint, often immensely. If you're too enamored by something, it takes on a godlike power over you and distorts your perceptions and your life. And no wonder people rage when that comfort is threatened. After all, in their minds, this is all they have. This is all they get. This is truly all there is. We forget that fact a lot of the time, that happiness isn't the point of life. We just want to feel good, and most of our day-to-day decisions revolve around that desire. But is that really sustainable? What happens if we aren't happy? When we focus on our lack of happiness and we use it as a reason to doubt God's love for us, then we have a problem. Going to another point of something I noticed. Relationships were ultimately empty. We come in and out of relationships like buying new shoes. We love the idea of being loved, but aren't completely sure we even know what love is. The whole relationship game thrives on ambiguity and pursuing our own interests, our own image and self-esteem, our own selfish desires, and our own ego. If low-commitment sexual promiscuity has become the norm, which it has, then there's something we just aren't getting. From what I was seeing, relationships, I'm talking romantically here, ultimately appeared like mere transactions. You provide this for me and I'll provide for you. As long as you can keep me happy, I'll do the same in return. You provide me with the things that I want and I'll reciprocate as long as it's convenient enough for me. But if I'm not feeling fulfilled enough, or the other person isn't making me happy enough, then I'll walk and go on to the next person. Liking someone's personality isn't particularly very deep. No one seemed to really provide much real meaning for why they were in or should remain in any given relationship. I rarely heard a convincing answer. It would always ultimately be shallow. Going to a new point. People wanted to live however they wanted, but it never worked. And even worse, they couldn't see it. Our culture's main operating principle, that freedom without any constraints or value judgments, has many serious problems. This kind of freedom often becomes just an excuse for selfishness. Freedom should be a means to an end, not an end in itself. But no one is ever actually free, right? Everyone needs love, meaning, and satisfaction in their lives, and so everyone is under the control of something. So freedom really can't be what the culture tells us it is. Real freedom comes from not the absence of constraints, but it is choosing the right constraints, and also the right freedoms to lose. We are not actually free to do whatever we choose. That's an impossibility and not the way freedom actually works. You get the best freedom only if you are willing to submit your choices to reality. And a new point, if people look to fleeting things or inconsequential things to give them an identity. The modern way to find an identity is crushing. It must base itself on success or achievement or on some human love relationship, and if any of these things is jeopardized or lost, you lose your very identity. It's inherently insecure, always in danger of disintegrating, being so conditioned by what others think and say of you, which means that perhaps the only place we can find a true identity is in somewhere or someone who is unchanging. Going to a new point. People couldn't justify having or not having morality. The problem of morals poses a great problem for secular people. It often leaves secular people in the position of insisting that all morals of other people are social constructs, yet they always act toward others as if theirs are not. How can both be so? Where do we turn to in a secular society to find shared morality that we can agree on? In our worldview, well, there's really no way to know. And so, secularism offers no way to dictate what is or isn't moral. Our contemporary culture has a mass confusion about moral commitments, has no good way to impart them to other people or to our children, and does not even have a good explanation about why we have such certain convictions. And modern people say that they do not believe in absolute moral values, but can't function without practically assuming them, and often won't admit they are doing it. How do we manage without even knowing what is or isn't moral? Going to another point, people looked to secular movements that proclaimed justice as if they actually worked. Secular people have trouble getting a firm hold on the slippery concepts of morality and truth. They often presuppose that they are the ones who have them, and so they often use them as bludgeons to intimidate and control those who share them and to condemn and punish those who do not. When they assume themselves to be, on the right side of history, they give themselves warrant to be abusive to those they believe to have essentially heretical opinions. We see this every day in our culture. Their justice, which they say is in order to bring down the oppressors, ironically only ever serves to create new oppressors. The cycle never has a way of ending. Which leads right into another point. I noticed a lack of grounding for human equality. If we embrace the Darwinian materialist story of humanity, that we just boil down to our physical parts, why should we be valued equally? If we follow that line of thinking, it doesn't tell us anything about how we ought to live. So then, I guess may the fittest survive over the unfit. Who's to say, really? So others might look to secular philosophers who can at least try and formulate some kind of ethical system to uphold human equality. We can observe that equality promotes flourishing, but if the universe is nothing more than what science can measure, we have no ultimate grounding for human value and equality. Because, hey, we're only atoms after all. On to a quite different point. In the secular world, what's the point of forgiveness? Unforgiveness is routinely leveraged in our culture by those intent on perpetually taking offense. So then why ever forgive people for anything? Why is the common response not only an unwillingness to accept forgiveness, but to outrightly demand that all persons hold debts over each other's heads to be fixed in some form of reparation, as if one is supposed to repent to other people, not to God, and only they have the power to say when forgiveness can be granted. Our culture's conception of repenting and forgiveness is so unbelievably warped. Our secular culture breeds hatred without any chances for healing. When someone has wronged you, the response is, take offense, demand that they repay, demand some abstract idea of justice, and make sure others detest them as well. In our culture, for some reason, it's widely seen that people cannot change, that any sins they commit, whether past or present, are dictated as unforgivable or not by the general populace based on arbitrary things like level of outrage or what agenda you support. Commit the wrong sin and you too will be crucified with no remorse. Which leads to another point. The false assumption that less religion would be better for society. Atheists argue that the world would be better off without religion, but you have to be highly selective with your examples to make that claim at all persuasive. And you have to ignore the data indicating that, in the United States at least, people who participate in religious community are happier, healthier, and live longer than those who don't. We could get into the fact that because of atheistic regimes in Maoist China, Hitler's Germany, and Stalinist Russia, the non-religious or even anti-religious caused the bloodiest century in human history. All these things are just a sampling of a list of reasons that I took from my own journey. The list could go on, but I think the point has been made. Once we can gather that there is good reason to question and scrutinize the status quo of the secular way, only then will we begin to realize we need to expand the search elsewhere. I do admit that not every one of the items on my list I presented here will automatically lead directly to a belief in the God of the Bible. Even all these points together do not directly point to the God of the Bible, but we cannot get directly to that belief without working our way out of unbelief first. You don't get all the way to the Christian God by one argument alone. We have to start far enough back. At this point, the issues I've raised are better explained by a God like the Christian God. But I know we haven't proved Christianity yet. We'll get there. All I've shown is that it could be the God of the Bible. What I'm saying here is, it seems to be that the better grounding for the answers to all these questions is a being like God rather than no God. And for me, this progression of thinking, with all of the points I've just listed, points that the secular world cannot account for or seem to be extremely unconvincing in its assertions of, it had to have happened this particular way for me, personally. It had to start with a growing unrest about the insufficient secular answers to questions like these. I think that we have to start with our knowledge that there must indeed be something more out there than secularism claims there is, and only from that point can we more thoroughly investigate what the other claims of reality are, what those implications are, and observe how they can or can't make more sense of our human experience. Some people will not even begin the journey of exploration, mostly because they think religion or Christianity does not even seem relevant enough to be worth their while. But as I've painstakingly tried to show here, it very much is worth your while. So the point here is, once a person can establish a good reason to explore Christianity, then we can progress into looking at those claims next. But a person will never move past that point until realizing that there is something wrong in the first place. It's essentially an awareness of something missing. It applies the same to our world and reality just as it does to ourselves on a personal level. We haven't gotten to that yet. That not only are there obvious things wrong with the secular explanation of the world, but there is something wrong with the secular explanation of what's wrong inside each of us. How too does a person know that they're a sinner in need of saving if they don't think there's anything wrong with themselves to begin with?